President Donald Trump's administration has announced a groundbreaking shift in education policy, focusing on streamlining the U.S. Department of Education. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt explained that the executive order aims to reduce the department's size and return control of education to local communities and state governments. The move comes in response to concerns over federal inefficiency and declining student performance over the last several decades.
Karoline, what do you say to critics of the president's education plan?
Where was their criticism of our nation's failing test scores for the last several decades? The Department of Education was founded in the 1970s, and since then we have spent more than $3 trillion at this federal bureaucracy. What has been the return on that investment for the American taxpayer? Levels that are less than ideal, less than proficient. Our children's test scores are incredibly concerning when it comes to reading rates, literacy rates, math, and science test scores. The numbers prove that, and this president is finally taking much needed action to return education to where it belongs, and that's to educators closest to students in their classrooms in their respective states. We're going to have a great event here later at 4 o'clock. There will be students here, teachers here, parents here, educators, and of course, governors from around the country who are very excited about taking on this responsibility to educate our nation's students.
Who's not going to run federal student loans?
So the Department of Education will be much smaller than it is today. As you know, the president's executive order directed Linda McMahon to greatly minimize the agency. So when it comes to student loans and Pell Grants, those will still be run out of the Department of Education. But we don't need to be spending more than $3 trillion over the course of a few decades on a department that's clearly failing in its initial intention to educate our students.
So is the federal government going to be much smaller than it is? Is it not going to be shut down completely? And then I have a second question.
As I said, Pell Grants and student loans will still be run out of the department in Washington, D.C., but the great responsibility of educating our nation's students will return to the state.
And the Department of Education plays a critical role in enforcing civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination. Who's going to do that now?
Any critical functions of the department such as that will remain. But again, we're greatly reducing the scale and the size of this department.
This president is finally taking much-needed action to return education to where it belongs, and that's to educators closest to students in their classrooms in their respective states, Leavitt said. She emphasized that despite scaling back the department, critical functions such as overseeing student loans, Pell Grants, and civil rights enforcement would remain federally managed. Leavitt pointed to the department's lackluster track record, noting that over $3 trillion has been spent since the agency's creation in the 1970s, with little improvement in key educational outcomes, including literacy and math scores. What has been the return on that investment for the American taxpayer? Schools that are less than ideal, our children's test scores are incredibly concerning, she said. Leavitt's remarks have sparked a wave of reactions, with conservatives praising the move as a necessary step toward returning power to states. Governors and local officials have expressed strong support, arguing that the shift would allow for more localized decision-making and greater parental involvement in education. However, critics, including civil rights organizations like the ACLU, have raised concerns about the potential negative impact on protections for minority students and students with disabilities. The ACLU warned that cutting back the department could jeopardize critical protections under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which guarantees specialized support for students with disabilities. This is a victory for states' rights, and for parents who demand greater influence over their children's education, Leavitt added in a Fox and Friends interview. We have to ask ourselves, where was their criticism of our nation's failing test scores for the last several decades? The Department of Education will not be eliminated entirely. Student loans, Pell Grants, and civil rights enforcement will remain in place. However, the scale of the department will be greatly reduced as part of the Trump administration's broader goal to reduce federal bureaucracy. As the executive order moves forward, the debate over federal versus state control of education is sure to intensify, with supporters framing the policy as a step toward empowering local communities and critics warning of a potential rollback of educational protections. The future of American education, already in flux, could shift significantly under this new approach. The Department of Education will be much smaller than it is today. When it comes to student loans and Pell Grants, those will still be run out of the Department of Education. Any critical functions of the department such as enforcing civil rights laws will remain, but again, we're greatly reducing the scale and the size of this department. As the nation grapples with this significant policy change, both sides of the debate will continue to voice their concerns. The Trump administration's emphasis on local control is set to reshape the landscape of education for years to come.